Hello, everyone. This is End Time Counterpoint. My name is Dan. Thanks for tuning in today. In this episode, I'm going to continue talking about the rapture and why Christians keep loving, adoring, and cherishing this blessed and treasured event. Now, in the previous episode, I talked about things from an emotional point of view and why Christians really want to love the rapture. But today I'm going to walk you through a few verses in the New Testament that should tell you that, as the old saying goes, truth is stranger than fiction. Rapture being the fiction and truth being what I'm going to read to you today. Now, in the past I've been told that I'm confusing the rapture for the second coming. But I don't think I'm confused at all. In fact, I'm trying to home in on the truth and just reduce things to its simplest form, as you do in mathematics. It's the rapture that is confusing and obfuscating. And that's just what the prophecy experts want, because the more confusing it is, the more they can hold Christians under their spell and keep their position as the experts. But today I want to walk you through a few verses and prove to you what it is that Jesus' followers actually preached. And it wasn't the rapture. I'm going to begin in Acts chapter 1, which is where we should all begin when we're trying to determine what gospel that Jesus' followers were preaching. Now, let's go to Acts chapter 1 and see what the promise was to the disciples of what Jesus was going to do next. Now, in Acts chapter 1, verse 9, it says that when he, Jesus, had spoken these things, while they beheld, that's his disciples, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. Now, that's quite a remarkable prophecy, isn't it? And they talked about that same Jesus returning, and that same Jesus is not a spirit or an avatar, and these are obviously angels who are talking to the disciples, and they made the promise of his coming right then and there. This is the promise of Jesus' physical return to this earth. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Based on this promise, what would Jesus' followers have expected him to do next? And what would they have preached that Jesus was going to do next? Well, they weren't preaching a rapture because that's not what was promised here in Acts chapter 1. They were promised that Jesus would return to the earth in the very same manner as he left. In other words, he left the earth, went up through the air, disappeared into the clouds, but when he returns, he's going to be coming through the clouds, down through the air, and will return back to this earth. That's the promise of his coming. Now, what else would the disciples have been preaching? Now remember, this is John and Peter and James and the others standing here watching and listening. So what would they have expected Jesus to do next but to physically return? The promise was that same Jesus shall return to this earth. Now, I'm going to show you a verse that proves that this is, in fact, what they had been preaching. I'm going to go to 2 Peter chapter 3 now and read a couple of verses here that will prove that this, not the rapture, is what Jesus' disciples had been preaching for a few years. Now, Peter said this in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3. He said, Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Now, you'll notice that they were scoffing at something, and that something is the promise of his coming. In other words, a guarantee that Jesus was going to return to this earth. Now, Perry Stone will have you think from this verse that people were scoffing at the rapture, but that's not what they were scoffing at. It says clearly here that people were scoffing at the promise of his coming. Well, where was that made? In Acts chapter 1. And the promise was that Jesus, the flesh and bone, physical, tangible, audible Jesus, was going to physically return to this earth. But the promise was not of the rapture, but of Jesus coming back to this earth. And people were scoffing at that because people can't wait very long for a promise to be fulfilled. And so people were getting impatient, perhaps, and they were getting soured on a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. And so they were scoffing and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Now, let's move along in the New Testament. I want to show you something else. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 1, we find that John's expectation was also that Jesus would physically return to this earth. And I'm sure his expectation was based on what we read earlier in Acts chapter 1. Let's go now to Revelation chapter 1. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, John says this to the church. He says, "Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him." Now, obviously, this has to be based on the promise that was made to John, as well as Peter and the others in Acts chapter 1. And in fact, this is remarkably similar to Peter's expectation that Christ would physically return to this earth. Revelation 1:7 is quite remarkable because it reveals the expectation of Jesus' followers. And this is what they had been preaching, like I said, for some years. And you can see that as you go along through the New Testament. But we finally get to the book of Revelation, and the promise and the expectation has not changed. "Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him." That's not the rapture. That's the return of Christ to this earth, as promised in Acts chapter 1. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, what about the rapture in Revelation chapter 4? Well, Revelation chapter 4 doesn't talk about a rapture. It's John relating his personal experience, how that he was caught up in the Spirit and then was able to see all these powerful images and write them down and relate them to the church. But that's not a rapture. That's a personal experience that John is relating. And in fact, it's a very similar experience to what Paul had when he said that he was caught up and saw things that he was not permitted to write. Very, very similar experiences. The expectation of Christ's return, however, is expressed very definitely in Revelation 1:7. And it's based on Acts chapter 1. And we read that where Christ was promised to return to this earth physically, and every eye will see him, as John adds here. Now, let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which is everybody's favorite in supporting the rapture, and we'll find that it describes something different entirely. And you know, a lot of people today, Christians especially, they think that Jesus Christ is now the captain of the Starship Enterprise and that he's going to have Scotty just beam up all the Christians. But you don't find in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 or anywhere else in the New Testament where it says that millions are just going to disappear. You just don't read that. What we do read, however, is that Christ is going to return to this earth and everybody's going to see him. That's what's described, believe it or not, here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So let me read a couple of verses here, and if you just pay attention, you'll see that Paul is describing what Peter and John described based on the promise of Acts chapter 1. Paul says in verse 16 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 that the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Now, everybody gets excited about the caught up part but everybody forgets about the Lord himself part. You see, when Paul says, the Lord himself shall descend, he's talking about that same flesh and bone Jesus that was mentioned in Acts chapter 1. Whichever you read, whether Acts chapter 1 or 1 Thessalonians 4, you will find that the verses are referring to the physical person of Jesus Christ. That same Jesus of Acts chapter 1 equates to the Lord himself in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So we are absolutely talking about and reading about the physical return of Jesus Christ in both passages. And when you go reading through this verse, you will find that this is nothing done in secret, but as John said in Revelation chapter 1, every eye will see this happening and transpiring. This is not anything done in secret. In fact, what you're reading in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is designed to get attention, not avoid it. This isn't about the disappearance of millions of Christians. This is about the action that Jesus Christ is going to take next. But 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 confirms one of Jesus' parables, especially the parable of the wheat and the tares, in which Jesus said that when he returns, he's going to send out his holy angels, and they will do the dividing and the separating and gather the good unto Christ. Well, that's exactly what's happening here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The Lord himself, that's in person, shall descend, that's coming out of the heavens to this earth, accompanied by a host of angels. And then what's happening next is that all the good people, the saints, are being gathered unto Christ. They are not disappearing. But Christians have been deceived for a long, long time. And Christians need to understand what the promise of his coming really is. And Christians need to reject the false doctrine that they have been hearing for many, many years now and get back into the Bible and accept the truth that Jesus will return and every eye shall see him. All right, folks, my name is Dan. I thank you for tuning in to this episode of End Time Counterpoint. If you have enjoyed this discussion, give it a thumbs up. Why don't you consider subscribing to my channel? I would greatly appreciate that. And keep in mind, too, that I have a book available. It is called Blinded by the Rapture. You can find it on Apple Books or Barnes & Noble, and you really need to get it. It will help you understand Bible prophecy. Once again, folks, I thank you for your kind attention today. My name is Dan. I will see you in the next episode.